They say your wedding day is supposed to be the most magical moment of your life, filled with love, joy, and celebration. But when your own family stands up at your reception and publicly humiliates you by calling you the poor charity case who finally found someone desperate enough to marry her, everything changes. My name is Celeste Hartwell, and this is the story of how one cruel moment at my wedding led to the most satisfying revelation of my entire life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never thought I'd be the type of person to crave revenge. Growing up in the shadow of my wealthy stepfamily in the prestigious Ashford Heights district of Willowbrook, I learned early that keeping quiet and staying invisible was the safest way to survive. But sometimes, life has a funny way of giving you exactly what you need at exactly the right moment. And sometimes, that moment happens to be when you're wearing a white dress, surrounded by 200 guests, and your stepmother decides to destroy you in front of everyone who matters. You see, for the past 8 years, I've been living what most people would call a double life. By day, I was Celeste, the quiet girl who worked at the local Willowbrook Community Center, barely scraping by on what my stepfamily believed was a measly nonprofit salary. I drove an old, beat-up Honda that I'd had since college, lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, and wore simple clothes that never cost more than $50. To them, I was exactly what they'd always believed me to be, the poor, unsuccessful stepdaughter who never quite measured up to their standards. But what they didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that Celeste Hartwell was also the founder and CEO of Meridian Dynamics, a tech empire that had quietly revolutionized digital infrastructure across 3 continents. Under the carefully constructed identity of C.H. Morgan, I had built a billion-dollar company from my tiny apartment, working 18-hour days while my stepfamily slept peacefully in their mansion, completely unaware that the failure they loved to ridicule had become one of the youngest female billionaires in the country. I kept my wealth hidden for a reason. Growing up with Vivian Ashford Hartwell as my stepmother had taught me everything I needed to know about how money corrupts relationships. When my father, Robert Hartwell, married Vivian 12 years ago, I watched him transform from a loving parent into someone who was more concerned with maintaining his new wife's lifestyle than protecting his own daughter. Vivian brought her twin daughters, Anastasia and Evangeline, into our home, and suddenly I went from being Daddy's little girl to being the inconvenient reminder of his first marriage. The favoritism was immediate and brutal. While Anastasia and Evangeline got designer everything, clothes, cars, private tutors, and eventually full rides to prestigious universities, I was told that character is built through struggle, and that I needed to learn the value of hard work. I watched my college fund disappear into Vivian's redecorating projects and the twins' extravagant Sweet 16 party. I worked 3 part-time jobs to put myself through state college while my stepsisters partied at Yale and Harvard on my father's dime. But here's what they never understood: every cruel comment, every dismissive look, every time they made me feel small and worthless, they were actually forging something stronger inside me. While they were spending Daddy's money on frivolous luxuries, I was teaching myself coding in my dorm room. While they were networking at country club parties, I was building algorithms that would eventually power half the internet. While they were living off family money, I was creating my own empire, one line of code at a time. The irony was beautiful, really. They thought they were watching me fail, but they were actually witnessing the birth of something they could never comprehend. Every family dinner where they talked about my dead-end job at the community center, I would smile quietly, knowing that I had just closed another multi-million-dollar deal that morning. Every Christmas where they gave me gift cards to discount stores while showering each other with expensive jewelry, I would graciously accept their charity, knowing that the watch on Vivian's wrist cost less than what I made in the time it took to unwrap it. I kept working at the community center because I genuinely loved helping people, and it provided the perfect cover for my real work. My official salary there was $34,000 a year, barely enough to survive in Willowbrook, and exactly the kind of number that confirmed all of Vivian's worst assumptions about my life choices. What she didn't know was that I donated more money to that community center each year than she spent on her entire wardrobe. When I got engaged to Jonathan Rivers, a kind-hearted teacher I'd met through my community work, my family's reaction was predictably condescending. Vivian actually laughed when I told her about the engagement. "Well," she said, stirring her martini with perfectly manicured nails, "I suppose even teachers need wives." At least he won't expect much. Anastasia and Evangeline exchanged those knowing looks they'd perfected over the years, the ones that said, "Poor Celeste, settling for so little because it's all she can get." They had no idea that Jonathan knew about Meridian dynamics. He was one of the few people I trusted with my secret, and he loved me for who I was, not what I had. But to my family, he was just another sign of my perpetual failure to live up to their standards. A teacher's salary plus a non-profit worker's salary equaled a lifetime of mediocrity in their minds. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What they also didn't know was that I had been planning this wedding as more than just a celebration of love. I had been planning it as the perfect stage for the revelation that would change everything between us forever. After years of quiet humiliation, of being the family disappointment, of watching them spend money that should have been partially mine while treating me like a charity case, I was ready to show them exactly who they had been underestimating all these years. The wedding was supposed to be my moment of truth. But I never could have predicted that Vivian would hand me the perfect opportunity on a silver platter, wrapped up in the cruelest insult she could devise. I never could have imagined that her need to humiliate me one more time would become the catalyst for the most satisfying moment of my entire life. But that's exactly what happened. And when it was over, when the truth was finally revealed and the power dynamics in my family were completely and permanently reversed, I realized something important. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. Sometimes it's about showing people exactly who you've always been, and watching them realize how completely they've underestimated you. This is that story. This is the story of how Celeste Hartwell, the family disappointment, became the woman who owned everything they thought they knew about power, success, and worth. And it all started with a wedding, a microphone, and the most perfectly timed insult in the history of family drama. Vivian Ashford Hartwell wasn't just wealthy, she was generationally, obscenely, embarrassingly wealthy. The kind of woman who owned 3 homes but complained about property taxes, who spent more on a single dinner party than most families made in a year, and who genuinely believed that poor people were poor because they simply weren't trying hard enough. When she married my father 12 years ago, she didn't just bring money into our lives. She brought a complete restructuring of everything I thought I knew about family, love, and worth. Before Vivian, our house in Willowbrook had been warm and lived in. My father and I would spend Saturday mornings making pancakes in our modest kitchen, and he'd listen to me read him stories I'd written in my little notebook. We weren't wealthy, but we were happy. We were enough. But Vivian saw our contentment as a personal insult to her vision of what life should look like. Within 6 months of the marriage, everything changed. Our cozy 3-bedroom house was sold, and we moved into Vivian's sprawling estate in Ashford Heights, a monument to excess that felt more like a museum than a home. The warmth disappeared immediately, replaced by marble floors that echoed every footstep and crystal chandeliers that cast cold, sharp light into every corner. Even the air felt different, somehow thinner and more expensive. Vivian's twin daughters, Anastasia and Evangeline, arrived like princesses returning to their rightful castle. At 16, they were already everything I would never be, blonde, poised, and utterly confident in their place in the world. They moved through the mansion like they owned it, which, I soon learned, they essentially did. While I was relegated to the smallest guest room in the East Wing, the twins each claimed massive suites with walk-in closets bigger than my old bedroom. The hierarchy in our new family was established immediately and brutally. Anastasia, older by 12 minutes, was the social butterfly. She planned charity galas and fundraising events with the casual ease of someone who had never questioned whether she belonged in those circles. At 17, she was already being courted by society photographers and lifestyle magazines. Vivian would beam with pride as she showed off newspaper clippings of Anastasia at various high-profile events, always perfectly dressed and always photographed with exactly the right people. Evangeline was the academic star, the one destined for greatness in law or politics. She had a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue, and she wielded both with surgical precision. While I struggled through my homework at the kitchen table, Evangeline held court in Vivian's elaborate home office, discussing current events and legal theories with private tutors who cost more per hour than my father made in a day. Vivian would listen to these conversations with the rapt attention of someone witnessing the birth of a future Supreme Court justice. And then there was me. 12-year-old Celeste, suddenly lost in a world where everything I said seemed wrong, everything I wore seemed cheap, and everything I wanted seemed impossibly out of reach. I wasn't blonde like the twins. I wasn't naturally graceful or effortlessly confident. I was just a girl who liked to read and write stories, who preferred quiet corners to grand ballrooms, and who had never realized that these preferences would mark me as fundamentally deficient in Vivian's world. The favoritism wasn't subtle. When school shopping season arrived, Vivian would take the twins on elaborate shopping expeditions to the luxury boutiques in downtown Willowbrook. They'd return with bags full of designer clothes, shoes that cost more than some people's rent, and accessories that made them look like junior socialites. Meanwhile, I was handed a credit card with a $200 limit and told to find something practical at the department store. I remember one particularly humiliating September afternoon when the twins came home from their shopping trip, practically glowing with excitement over their new wardrobes. Anastasia twirled in a dress that probably cost more than my father's monthly car payment, while Evangeline modeled shoes that I later learned were from a designer I'd only heard about in magazines. I was sitting in the corner, trying to finish a book report, when Vivian noticed me watching. "Celeste, dear," she said in that voice she used when she wanted to sound maternal in front of my father, "didn't you get anything nice for yourself today?" I held up the single bag from Macy's clearance section, containing 2 pairs of jeans and 3 basic shirts that would have to last me the entire school year. "I found some things," I said quietly. Vivian examined my purchases with the kind of expression someone might wear while inspecting spoiled milk. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose you have to start somewhere. Maybe next year you'll develop better taste." The twins giggled, and I felt my cheeks burn with shame. It wasn't just about the clothes, it was about the message. You don't deserve what they deserve. You're not worth what they're worth. You should be grateful for whatever scraps we throw your way. This pattern extended to everything. When Anastasia wanted to take horseback riding lessons at the exclusive Willowbrook Equestrian Club, Vivian immediately signed her up and bought her a complete riding outfit. When Evangeline expressed interest in debate team, Vivian hired a former championship debater to give her private coaching sessions. But when I asked if I could take a creative writing class at the community center, a class that cost $35, Vivian sighed dramatically and told me that we needed to be more mindful of unnecessary expenses. The extracurricular activities were just the beginning. The twins attended private school at Ashford Academy, where tuition cost more per year than many people's salaries. They had tutors for every subject, college prep counselors, and SAT coaches. Their college applications were crafted by professional consultants who knew exactly which strings to pull and which connections to leverage. I, meanwhile, attended Willowbrook Public High School. Not because it was a bad school, it actually had some excellent teachers and programs. But because, as Vivian explained to my father one evening when she thought I wasn't listening, Celeste needs to learn how to succeed in the real world. She can't rely on family connections and advantages like the girls. She needs to develop character. Character. That was Vivian's favorite word when it came to me. I needed to develop character through struggle. I needed to build character through disappointment. I needed to learn character through watching my stepsisters receive everything I was denied. Character, apparently, was something that could only be forged in the fires of deliberately imposed hardship. The college years were the worst. While Anastasia and Evangeline were accepted to Yale and Harvard respectively, with generous donations from Vivian smoothing the way, I was told that I'd need to figure out my own path. My college fund, which my father had been contributing to since I was born, had mysteriously evaporated. Vivian claimed it had been invested in family improvements, like the new pool house and the expanded wine cellar. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through Willowbrook State University, mornings at a coffee shop, afternoons tutoring younger students, and weekends at a local bookstore. While my stepsisters posted Instagram photos of themselves at exclusive campus events and spring break trips to Europe, I spent my breaks working double shifts to pay for textbooks and ramen noodles. But here's what Vivian never understood: every insult, every dismissal, every moment when she made me feel small and worthless, she was actually creating something dangerous. She was creating a person who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. She was forging someone who would never, ever forget what it felt like to be powerless. And while she was busy molding me into what she thought was a cautionary tale, I was quietly teaching myself the skills that would eventually make her entire fortune look like pocket change. While she was explaining to dinner guests how important it was to teach children the value of hard work by making them struggle, I was building the foundation of an empire that would make her precious Ashford Heights mansion look like a starter home. The irony was perfect. Vivian thought she was teaching me my place in the world. Instead, she was teaching me exactly how much I hated having a place assigned to me by someone else. She thought she was showing me the importance of knowing my limitations. Instead, she was showing me that the only limitations that mattered were the ones I imposed on myself. She created a monster, really. A quiet, polite, perfectly mannered monster who would spend the next decade plotting the most elegant revenge in the history of stepfamily dynamics. She just didn't know it yet. The humiliation wasn't limited to material things. Vivian had a gift for psychological warfare that would have impressed military strategists. She understood that the most effective way to break someone wasn't through dramatic confrontations or obvious cruelty. It was through a steady drip of small moments that slowly eroded your sense of self-worth until you began to believe that maybe, just maybe, you really were as worthless as she suggested. Family dinners became elaborate theater productions where I played the role of the disappointing supporting character. Every evening at 6:30 sharp, we'd gather in the formal dining room with its imported Italian marble table and crystal chandelier that cost more than most people's cars. Vivian would hold court at one end while my father sat at the other, and the twins would flank them like perfectly groomed courtiers. I was relegated to the middle of one side, positioned so that I could see everyone but somehow still felt invisible. The conversations followed a predictable script. Vivian would ask Anastasia about her latest social triumph, perhaps a successful charity auction she'd organized or a mention in the society pages of the Willowbrook Herald. Anastasia would regale us with stories of wealthy donors and influential connections, her voice bright with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Vivian would beam with maternal pride, asking follow-up questions and praising her daughter's natural leadership abilities. Then the attention would shift to Evangeline, who would update us on her academic achievements. Her grades were always perfect, naturally, but more importantly, her teachers consistently praised her insight and intellectual maturity. She had been accepted into the National Honor Society as a junior, had been invited to participate in a prestigious summer program at Georgetown University, and was already being recruited by several Ivy League schools for early admission programs. Evangeline has such a brilliant legal mind, Vivian would say, dabbing at her lips with a linen napkin that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Professor Morrison told me just yesterday that she's the most naturally gifted student he's encountered in 20 years of teaching constitutional law. My father would nod approvingly, asking thoughtful questions about Evangeline's latest paper or debate competition. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and each time I heard it, something inside me withered a little more. This was how he used to talk about my stories when I was younger, before Vivian convinced him that creative writing was a frivolous hobby rather than a serious pursuit. And then, inevitably, the conversation would turn to me. But unlike with the twins, there was never excitement or genuine interest in these inquiries. Instead, there was a kind of performative concern that felt more like a medical examination than a family conversation. "And how are things at the community center, Celeste?" Vivian would ask, her tone suggesting that she was inquiring about a particularly tedious job at a sewage treatment plant. "Are you still helping with the children's programs?" I would update them on my work, the literacy program I developed for struggling readers, the computer skills classes I taught to seniors, the after-school tutoring that was helping dozens of kids improve their grades. But somehow, when I described these accomplishments, they sounded small and insignificant in the opulent setting of our dining room. Vivian had a way of listening that made it clear she considered my efforts to be barely worthy of acknowledgement. "That's nice, dear," she would say when I finished, the dismissal clear in her voice. "It's important to give back to the less fortunate." The implication was obvious. I was discussing charity work because it was the only kind of work someone like me was qualified to do. The contrast became even more stark when I attempted to share my actual achievements. When I graduated summa cum laude from Willowbrook State, I mentioned it during one of these dinners, expecting at least some acknowledgement of the accomplishment. I had worked incredibly hard for that honor, maintaining a 4.0 GPA while working multiple jobs and completing a senior thesis that my professor had called graduate-level work. Summa cum laude, Vivian repeated slowly, as if tasting the words and finding them slightly sour. Well, I suppose the standards at state schools are different. It's wonderful that you were able to excel in that environment. Anastasia, who had graduated from Yale with a 3.2 GPA and no academic honors, received a graduation party that rivaled some people's weddings. The guest list included local politicians, business leaders, and society figures. Professional photographers captured every moment. The celebration was featured in 2 different lifestyle magazines. My graduation was marked with a dinner at Olive Garden and a card that Vivian had clearly purchased at the last minute from the grocery store pharmacy section. The pattern extended beyond academic achievements to every aspect of my life. When I received a promotion at the community center, becoming the youngest program coordinator in their history, Vivian's response was a patronizing smile and a comment about how some people are meant for small ponds. When I was featured in the local newspaper for developing an innovative literacy program that was being replicated by community centers across the state, she glanced at the article and said, "How nice that they're giving you recognition for your little project." But perhaps the most painful pattern was how my father slowly began to adopt Vivian's perspective. The man who had once encouraged my writing and praised my creativity started viewing my accomplishments through her lens. When I told him about the literacy program, he nodded politely but then immediately shifted the conversation to Evangeline's latest academic honor. When I mentioned that I was considering graduate school, he suggested that I might want to think about practical options that wouldn't put me in debt. The twins, to their credit, weren't actively cruel to me. They simply existed in a completely different universe, one where success and recognition were natural birthright rather than something that had to be fought for and earned. They were kind in the way that people are kind to service workers, polite, but with an underlying assumption that we fundamentally belong to different classes of humanity. Anastasia would occasionally ask about my life with what seemed like genuine interest, but her questions revealed how little she understood about my reality. "Oh, you work 3 jobs. That must be so interesting. I don't know how you find the time. I can barely manage my volunteer commitments and my social calendar." She wasn't being malicious, she literally couldn't comprehend a world where working wasn't optional. Evangeline was more direct in her dismissiveness. During one particularly memorable family gathering, I mentioned that I was teaching myself computer programming in my spare time. She looked at me with the expression someone might wear when observing a fascinating but ultimately doomed science experiment. "Programming," she said, raising one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Isn't that rather technical? I mean, I suppose someone has to do those jobs, but it seems like such a limiting career path. Don't you want to do something more meaningful?" The irony, of course, was that while she was dismissing programming as beneath serious consideration, I was already 3 years into building what would eventually become Meridian Dynamics. While she was studying constitutional law and preparing for a career arguing cases in front of judges, I was writing algorithms that would eventually be used by millions of people around the world. But I had learned not to defend myself, not to argue, not to try to explain why she was wrong. I had learned that in this family, my accomplishments would always be diminished, my potential would always be questioned, and my worth would always be measured against a standard I could never hope to meet. So I smiled politely and said, "You're probably right. I'll think about it." And then I went home to my tiny apartment and wrote code until 3 in the morning, fueled by the kind of anger that burns clean and bright and sustainable. Every dismissive comment, every patronizing smile, every moment when they made me feel small, I fed it all into my work. I let their condescension become my motivation and their disrespect become my determination. They thought they were teaching me to accept my limitations. Instead, they were teaching me to despise the very concept of limitations. They thought they were showing me my place in the world. Instead, they were showing me exactly what kind of world I wanted to build when I had the power to build it myself. And every single day, I was getting closer to having that power. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March, 3 months after my 22nd birthday. I had just returned from my evening shift at the bookstore, exhausted from a day that had started at 5 a.m. with my coffee shop job and included 6 hours of classes at Willowbrook State. My feet ached, my back was sore from lifting boxes of inventory, and I had approximately 3 hours to complete a research paper on digital marketing trends that was due the next morning. I walked into the mansion through the side entrance, the one designated for staff and deliveries, as Vivian had explained when I'd made the mistake of using the front door once too often. The main house was buzzing with activity, and I could hear laughter and conversation coming from the formal living room. As I made my way toward the stairs, hoping to slip unnoticed to my room, Vivian's voice rang out across the marble foyer. "Celeste. Perfect timing. Come join us for a moment." I wanted nothing more than to pretend I hadn't heard her, but years of conditioning had taught me that ignoring Vivian's summons only led to more elaborate punishments later. I dropped my backpack by the stairs and walked toward the living room, where I found an elegant gathering that looked like something out of a lifestyle magazine. Vivian was hosting what she called one of her intimate soirees, a monthly gathering of Willowbrook's social elite that served as both networking opportunity and subtle status competition. About 20 people were scattered throughout the room, holding crystal glasses of wine that probably cost more per bottle than I made in a week. The conversation paused as I entered, and I became acutely aware of my coffee-stained apron, my discount store jeans, and the fact that I probably smelled like a combination of espresso and old books. "Everyone," Vivian announced with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, "I'd like you to meet my stepdaughter, Celeste. She's just finishing up at our local state university." There was a polite murmur of acknowledgement from the group, but I could see the way their eyes took in my appearance, mentally cataloging every detail that marked me as someone who didn't belong in their world. Mrs. Pemberton, the wife of Willowbrook's mayor, tilted her head with what might have been sympathy or curiosity. "How wonderful," she said in the tone people use when they're trying to be kind about something they consider unfortunate. "And what are you studying, dear?" "Business and computer science," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, how practical," said Mr. Worthington, the owner of Willowbrook's largest real estate development company. "Very sensible to focus on employable skills." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, but it was Vivian's next comment that shattered something inside me forever. "Yes, we've always encouraged Celeste to be realistic about her prospects," she said, swirling her wine with practiced elegance. "Not everyone can follow their dreams, after all. Some of us need to focus on finding stable, modest employment." Celeste has always been very grounded in her expectations. The room fell silent for a moment, and I felt every pair of eyes on me. The pity was almost worse than the dismissal. These people, these wealthy, successful, influential people, were looking at me like I was a charity case, someone to be gently managed rather than taken seriously. In that moment, I realized that this was how Vivian saw me, not as a threat to be neutralized or a competitor to be defeated, but as a problem to be managed with appropriate expectations. That night, I sat in my small room and made a decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop, a refurbished machine I'd bought with money saved from countless double shifts, and I began to write. Not a school paper or a work report, but a business plan. A real business plan for a real company that would solve real problems in ways that had never been attempted before. I had been dabbling in programming for 3 years, teaching myself languages and frameworks during stolen moments between jobs and classes. What had started as curiosity had evolved into genuine skill, and what had begun as skill was now becoming something closer to vision. I could see gaps in the digital infrastructure that powered modern business, inefficiencies and vulnerabilities that could be addressed with the right combination of innovative coding and strategic thinking. But more than that, I could see an opportunity to build something that would be entirely mine. Something that Vivian couldn't dismiss or diminish or manage with lowered expectations. Something that would prove, once and for all, that her assessment of my prospects had been not just wrong, but spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. I named the company Meridian Dynamics, choosing the name carefully. A meridian is a line of longitude that circles the Earth, connecting opposite poles. It seemed fitting for a company that would bridge different worlds and bring together technologies that had never been integrated before. The word dynamics suggested movement, energy, change, everything that my life with Vivian's family had lacked. Working 18-hour days became my new normal, but for the first time in years, the exhaustion felt purposeful rather than punitive. I would finish my shifts at the coffee shop and bookstore, complete my coursework for my business and computer science double major, and then spend the hours between midnight and dawn building the foundation of what would become my empire. The secrecy was crucial. I couldn't afford to have Vivian discover what I was doing, partly because I knew she would find ways to sabotage it, but mostly because I wanted the revelation to be perfect. I wanted the moment when she learned the truth to be so shocking, so complete, and so undeniable that she would never be able to rationalize it away or diminish its significance. I opened business accounts under a carefully constructed corporate identity, using my initials and middle name to create the persona of C.H. Morgan, a mysterious entrepreneur whose background was deliberately obscured by layers of legal entities and privacy protections. I registered the company in Delaware, obtained the necessary licenses and permits, and began building the technological infrastructure that would support what I was planning. The first breakthrough came 6 months later. I had developed a security protocol that could integrate with existing business software in ways that had never been possible before. Instead of requiring companies to overhaul their entire digital infrastructure, my system could layer seamlessly over their current setup, providing enhanced protection without disrupting their workflow. I tested the concept with a small local business, offering my services for free in exchange for feedback and testimonials. The results were extraordinary. Their system security improved by 300% while their operational efficiency actually increased rather than decreased. Word began to spread quietly through the local business community, and I started receiving inquiries from companies that were willing to pay for what I was offering. By the end of my senior year at Willowbrook State, Meridian Dynamics had 12 clients and was generating enough revenue to support itself. But more importantly, I had proven to myself that Vivian's assessment of my capabilities was not just wrong, it was laughably, embarrassingly wrong. Every evening when I sat at that formal dining room table, listening to Vivian praise Anastasia's latest social triumph or Evangeline's academic achievement, I would smile politely and nod appropriately. But inside, I was calculating. I was planning. I was building something that would make their accomplishments look like children's games. The girl who had walked into that living room in her coffee-stained apron was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that respect wasn't something you could earn from people like Vivian, it was something you had to take. And I was getting very, very good at taking what I wanted. I stopped caring about their approval that night. I stopped hoping that someday they would see my worth. Instead, I started planning for the day when they would have no choice but to acknowledge it. The transformation was complete. I was no longer Celeste the disappointment, Celeste the charity case, Celeste the one with realistic expectations. I was Celeste the founder, Celeste the CEO, Celeste the woman who was about to change everything. They just didn't know it yet. The next 2 years passed in a blur of calculated deception and explosive growth. While my family continued to see me as the struggling community center worker barely scraping by, Meridian Dynamics was quietly becoming one of the most innovative tech companies in the country. The contrast between my public persona and my private reality became so stark that sometimes I felt like I was living in two completely different universes. My days followed a carefully orchestrated routine designed to maintain the illusion of my modest circumstances while building an empire in the shadows. I would arrive at the community center each morning at 8, wearing the same rotation of simple clothes I'd been cycling through for years. My colleagues there knew me as Celeste, the dedicated program coordinator who biked to work because she couldn't afford a car, who brought lunch in brown bags because eating out was too expensive, and who always volunteered for the weekend shifts because she needed the overtime pay. What they didn't know was that during my lunch breaks, I was conducting video conferences with Fortune 500 executives from the supply closet that I'd converted into a makeshift office. While they thought I was updating donor databases, I was actually managing a portfolio of clients that included 3 major banks, 2 international consulting firms, and a government defense contractor that had signed the largest security integration deal in Meridian Dynamics history. The government contract had been a particular coup. The Department of Defense had been struggling with cybersecurity vulnerabilities across multiple agencies, and traditional solutions required massive overhauls that would take years to implement and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. My system could integrate with their existing infrastructure in a matter of weeks, providing better security at a fraction of the cost. The contract was worth $47 million over 3 years, and it established Meridian Dynamics as a serious player in the federal marketplace. But even as my company's revenue exploded into 8 figures, I maintained my cover with obsessive attention to detail. I still lived in the same cramped studio apartment I'd rented as a college student, still drove the same beaten-down Honda that made concerning noises whenever I started it, and still wore clothes that looked like they came from discount retailers. Every aspect of my visible life had to support the narrative that I was exactly what my family believed me to be, a well-meaning but ultimately limited person making the best of modest circumstances. The financial logistics of maintaining this double life required increasingly sophisticated planning. I couldn't simply deposit $47 million into my personal checking account without raising questions, so I created a complex network of holding companies, investment vehicles, and offshore accounts that would have impressed Swiss bankers. Money flowed through carefully constructed channels, appearing and disappearing in ways that left no trail connecting C.H. Morgan to Celeste Hartwell. I bought my first property, a sprawling estate in the mountains outside Willowbrook, through a real estate trust that listed the owner as a Delaware corporation with shareholders that traced back to a Cayman Islands investment fund. The house was magnificent, 12,000 square feet of glass and steel architecture, with views that stretched for miles and technology integration that made it feel like something from a science fiction movie. It became my real home, the place where I could finally be myself without pretense or performance. But my family never saw it. As far as they knew, I still lived in that studio apartment with the broken air conditioning and the neighbor who played loud music until 3 in the morning. I would drive my old Honda to family dinners, park it in their circular driveway next to Anastasia's BMW and Evangeline's Mercedes, and listen to them discuss their latest purchases while I ate silently and smiled politely. The contrast became almost surreal during holiday gatherings. I remember one particular Christmas dinner when Evangeline was complaining about the limitations of her trust fund. Apparently, $25,000 per month wasn't sufficient for her lifestyle needs now that she was attending Harvard Law School. She wanted to lease a more expensive apartment in Cambridge, something appropriate for networking with the right people, but Vivian was concerned about setting a precedent for excessive spending. As I listened to this conversation, I was mentally reviewing the quarterly reports that showed Meridian Dynamics had just closed its most profitable quarter in company history. We had expanded into 3 new markets, acquired 2 smaller competitors, and signed partnership agreements with technology giants that I'd only dreamed of working with 2 years earlier. The profit margins were extraordinary, and the growth trajectory suggested that we would cross the billion-dollar valuation threshold within the next 18 months. But I nodded sympathetically when Evangeline expressed her frustration about financial constraints, and I even offered to help her research more affordable apartment options in Boston. The irony was delicious. The family failure offering to help the Harvard Law student find housing she could afford on her generous allowance. The most challenging aspect of maintaining my cover wasn't the financial complexity or the logistical gymnastics, it was the psychological toll of constantly diminishing my own accomplishments. During every family interaction, I had to suppress the natural human desire to be recognized for what I'd achieved. When Vivian would praise Anastasia for organizing a charity event that raised $50,000, I would smile and nod appropriately, knowing that I had personally donated more than that to various causes in the previous month alone. When my father would express concern about my job security at the community center, worrying that nonprofit funding was always uncertain and that I should consider more stable career options, I would thank him for his concern and assure him that I was being careful about my future. Meanwhile, Meridian Dynamics was being courted by 3 different venture capital firms who wanted to invest at valuations that would make me one of the wealthiest women under 30 in the country. The acquisition phase of my plan began during the 2nd year after graduation. I had learned through careful research that Vivian's wealth, while substantial, was not as secure as she liked to project. The Ashford family fortune was largely tied up in real estate holdings and traditional investments that were performing well but not spectacularly. More importantly, several key properties and business interests were vulnerable to the right kind of strategic pressure. I began purchasing debt instruments and minority stakes in companies that connected to the Ashford financial network. Nothing dramatic or obvious, just small positions that gave me insight into their business operations and financial strategies. I was building a web of influence that would eventually allow me to apply pressure in ways they would never see coming. The law firm that managed Vivian's legal affairs became a particular focus. Thornfield, Blackstone and Associates was a respected but financially stretched practice that specialized in wealth management for old money families like the Ashfords. When they needed a significant loan to upgrade their technology infrastructure, Meridian Dynamics subsidiary was happy to provide financing at very reasonable terms. The partnership agreement included some standard clauses about information sharing and collaborative business development that seemed routine but would prove crucial later. Similarly, when Ashford Properties needed additional capital for a major development project, I arranged for a private investment fund to provide the necessary financing. The terms were generous, almost suspiciously so, but Vivian's financial advisors were too focused on the immediate benefits to scrutinize the long-term implications of some seemingly minor contractual details. By the time I met Jonathan Rivers, I had built not just a billion-dollar company, but an entire network of strategic relationships and financial instruments that gave me unprecedented influence over my family's economic stability. They had no idea that the quiet girl who worked at the community center and worried about her rent payments had become someone who could reshape their entire world with a few carefully placed phone calls. Jonathan was the first person I'd met in years who saw me for who I really was, rather than who I was pretending to be. When I finally revealed my true identity to him, 6 months into our relationship, his reaction was everything I could have hoped for. He wasn't impressed by the money, he was impressed by the intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking that had made it possible. "You're incredible," he said after I'd explained everything. "But aren't you exhausted from living two completely different lives?" "Not exhausted," I replied. "Motivated. Every day I spend pretending to be what they think I am just makes me more excited for the day when I can show them what I actually became." That day was coming soon. Sooner than any of them realized. When Jonathan proposed to me on a quiet Sunday morning in his modest apartment, surrounded by stacks of student papers and the smell of coffee brewing, I knew immediately that our wedding would become the stage for the revelation I'd been planning for years. Not because I wanted to overshadow what should have been the happiest day of our lives, but because I understood that Vivian would never be able to resist using our wedding as another opportunity to demonstrate her superiority and my inferiority. The engagement announcement itself provided the first glimpse of what was to come. When I called to share the news with my family, Vivian's response was everything I had expected and more. "How wonderful, darling," she said in that tone she reserved for announcing minor disappointments. "A teacher, you said? Well, I suppose it's important to marry someone from your own level. Jonathan seems like a very nice young man, and I'm sure you'll be quite happy together in your little life." That phrase, "your little life," crystallized everything I needed to know about how the wedding planning process would unfold. Vivian didn't see our union as a celebration to be honored, she saw it as a charity case to be managed with appropriate expectations. Within hours of the engagement announcement, she had taken control of the entire planning process with the ruthless efficiency of a military strategist. "Now, Celeste," she announced during our first planning meeting at the mansion, "we need to be realistic about what kind of wedding is appropriate for your circumstances. I've taken the liberty of researching some lovely venues that would be perfect for a small, intimate ceremony. Nothing too elaborate or expensive, of course. We don't want people to think you're living beyond your means." She spread out brochures for various locations around Willowbrook, each more modest than the last. The community center where I worked. The basement fellowship hall at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. A local park pavilion that could be rented for $300 per day. Even the most generous option, a small banquet room at the Willowbrook Country Inn, looked like something from a budget wedding planning magazine. "I think the inn would be lovely," Vivian continued, circling the price information with a gold pen. "It seats about 60 people comfortably, which should be perfect for your guest list. After all, it's not like you have extensive social connections that would require a larger venue." The dismissal was so casual, so automatic, that I almost admired its efficiency. In 3 sentences, she had managed to insult my social status, my financial resources, and my overall worth as a human being. It was impressive, really, how she could deliver such comprehensive condescension while maintaining the pretense of helpfulness. But what Vivian didn't realize was that her determination to control and diminish our wedding was actually providing me with the perfect opportunity to execute the plan I'd been developing for over 2 years. Every decision she made, every limitation she imposed, every moment of subtle humiliation she orchestrated was actually serving my larger purpose. "That sounds wonderful," I told her, smiling with what I hoped looked like grateful acceptance. "The inn would be perfect." You always know exactly what's appropriate. Over the following months, the planning process became an elaborate dance of manipulation and misdirection. Vivian insisted on choosing everything: the venue, the catering menu, the flowers, even my dress. She selected a simple white gown from a mid-range bridal shop, explaining that anything more elaborate would look pretentious given your circumstances. The dress was perfectly fine, even pretty, but it cost less than what Anastasia had spent on shoes for her last charity gala. The guest list became another exercise in social hierarchy management. Vivian invited her entire social circle, the same people who had witnessed my humiliation at her soirée 3 years earlier. The mayor and his wife, the country club president, the prominent business leaders who formed the core of Willowbrook's establishment. These weren't people who cared about Jonathan or me. They were people who would serve as an audience for whatever performance Vivian was planning. Meanwhile, my actual friends and colleagues were relegated to a small section of tables near the back of the room. The people who had worked with me at the community center, a few college friends who still lived in the area, Jonathan's teaching colleagues from Willowbrook Elementary. Good people, genuine people, but not the kind of people who impressed Vivian or validated her social status. The most revealing moment came during a dress fitting 6 weeks before the wedding. Vivian had insisted on accompanying me, ostensibly to provide guidance but actually to ensure that I didn't make any choices that might reflect poorly on the family's reputation. As the seamstress made final adjustments to the hem, Vivian studied my reflection in the mirror with the expression of someone evaluating a moderately successful home renovation project. "You know, Celeste," she said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about the ceremony itself. I'd like to say a few words during the reception. Nothing formal, just some brief remarks about family and new beginnings. I think it would be appropriate for someone to acknowledge how far you've come, despite everything." The threat was unmistakable. She was planning to use our wedding reception as a platform for one final, public demonstration of her authority over my life. In front of everyone who mattered in Willowbrook, in front of Jonathan's family and friends, in front of the social elite who had already witnessed my humiliation once before, she intended to deliver some kind of speech that would position her as the benevolent stepmother graciously acknowledging her disappointing stepdaughter's modest achievements. "That would be lovely," I replied, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "I'm sure you'll find exactly the right words." And I meant it. Because what Vivian didn't understand was that she was about to provide me with the perfect setup for the revelation I'd been planning. Her need to assert dominance, her compulsion to remind everyone of my supposed limitations, her absolute confidence in her own superiority, all of it was serving my purpose better than I could have orchestrated myself. The final pieces fell into place during the last month before the wedding. I arranged for certain key documents to be prepared and notarized, ensuring they would be available at exactly the right moment. I coordinated with my attorney to have specific legal representatives present at the reception, disguised as regular guests but positioned to serve important papers if necessary. Most importantly, I made sure that several journalists would be in attendance, not obvious reporters, but society page correspondents and business magazine freelancers who would be able to document and disseminate whatever happened. Jonathan knew about my plan, of course. We had discussed it extensively, and while he initially tried to talk me out of it, he eventually came to understand that this confrontation was inevitable. Vivian would never stop trying to diminish me, and I would never be able to build a healthy relationship with my family until the power dynamic was fundamentally altered. "Are you sure about this?" he asked me the night before the wedding, as we sat in his apartment going over the final details. "Once you do this, there's no going back. Your relationship with your family will never be the same." "It was never really a relationship to begin with," I replied. "It was a performance where I played the role of the grateful failure while they played the roles of the generous, long-suffering benefactors. I'm tired of performing. Tomorrow, they're going to meet the real me." The wedding morning arrived with perfect spring weather and an almost supernatural sense of anticipation. As I got ready in the small bridal suite at the Willowbrook Country Inn, surrounded by the modest flowers Vivian had selected and wearing the simple dress she had approved, I felt calmer than I had in years. The waiting was almost over. The performance was about to end. In a few hours, Vivian would stand up in front of 200 people and deliver what she believed would be the final word in our long-running dynamic. She would position herself as the wise, generous authority figure graciously acknowledging my small accomplishments while subtly reminding everyone of my limitations and her own superiority. And then, in front of all those same people, I was going to show her exactly what those limitations had actually accomplished. The stage was set. The audience was assembled. And Vivian had no idea that she was about to become the supporting character in someone else's story. The ceremony itself was beautiful, despite Vivian's best efforts to keep it modest. Jonathan looked handsome in his simple black suit, and when he saw me walking down the aisle, his smile was so genuine and full of love that for a moment I almost forgot about everything else. The vows we exchanged were heartfelt and personal, written by us rather than chosen from a book, and when we kissed as husband and wife, the applause from our guests felt warm and sincere. For those 30 minutes, I was just a bride marrying the man she loved. The revenge plot, the family dynamics, the years of humiliation, all of it faded into background noise as Jonathan and I promised to build a life together based on honesty, respect, and genuine partnership. It was exactly the kind of moment that should have been the highlight of the entire day. But I knew Vivian wouldn't let it stay that way. The reception began smoothly enough. The Willowbrook country inn had done their best with the limited budget Vivian had approved, and the modest ballroom actually looked quite charming with its simple white tablecloths and small centerpieces of local wildflowers. The guests seemed to be enjoying themselves, and the early conversations were filled with the kind of genuine congratulations and well wishes that make weddings special. I moved through the room greeting people, accepting hugs from my community center colleagues, chatting with Jonathan's fellow teachers, and making polite conversation with Vivian's social circle. The mayor's wife complimented my dress. The country club president asked about our honeymoon plans. Everything felt normal and pleasant, the kind of low-key celebration that suited Jonathan's and my actual personalities. But I could see Vivian watching me from across the room, and I recognized the look in her eyes. She was waiting for her moment, calculating the perfect time to seize control of the narrative and remind everyone of exactly who was in charge. As the evening progressed and the wine flowed more freely, her confidence seemed to grow more pronounced. The moment came during what should have been the most joyful part of the reception. Jonathan and I had just finished our first dance, a simple, sweet moment to a song we both loved, and the DJ was inviting other couples to join us on the small dance floor. The atmosphere was relaxed and happy, filled with laughter and conversation. That's when Vivian made her move. She appeared at the DJ's station with the kind of authoritative presence that brooked no argument, speaking briefly to him before taking the microphone with practiced ease. The music faded, and conversation gradually stopped as people realized that an announcement was coming. "Good evening, everyone," Vivian began, her voice carrying clearly through the small ballroom. She was wearing an elegant navy blue dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her smile was perfectly calibrated to suggest warmth while maintaining an undertone of superiority. "I hope you're all enjoying this lovely celebration." There was polite applause and murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Jonathan and I were still standing in the middle of the dance floor, and I could feel his hand tighten slightly around mine. He knew what was coming, even if the specifics were still unclear. As Celeste's stepmother, Vivian continued, "I wanted to take a moment to share some thoughts about family, about growth, and about the importance of accepting our place in the world with grace and gratitude." The phrasing was already ominous. Accepting our place in the world wasn't the kind of thing people said about brides on their wedding day unless they were planning to deliver some kind of backhanded commentary about that place being disappointingly low. When Celeste first came into our family 12 years ago, she was just a young girl dealing with the challenges that come with being different from the rest of us. Vivian paused, her smile becoming more pronounced. Different backgrounds, different expectations, different capabilities. I felt the room temperature seem to drop several degrees. The guests were beginning to sense that this wasn't going to be a traditional, heartwarming stepmother speech. Some people were looking uncomfortable, others were leaning forward with the kind of fascinated attention that people pay to car accidents. "Over the years, we've watched Celeste work very hard to find her place in the world," Vivian continued, her tone suggesting that this effort had been both admirable and ultimately limited in its success. "She's always been so determined, so earnest in her attempts to achieve something meaningful." The pause before "something meaningful" was perfectly timed, suggesting that those achievements had been modest at best. Several of Vivian's friends were nodding knowingly, as if they were all part of some shared understanding about my limitations. And I have to say, we're all so proud of how far she's come, despite the obvious challenges, Vivian said, gesturing toward me with what looked like maternal affection but felt like condescension. Working at the community center, finding such a nice, stable man like Jonathan, building a modest little life that suits her capabilities so perfectly. The word capabilities hit the room like a slap. There was no mistaking the implication. This was a speech about someone who had done the best they could with limited abilities, someone who deserved credit for effort rather than achievement. But Vivian wasn't finished. She was building to something bigger, something that would cement her dominance over this moment and ensure that everyone in the room understood the true nature of our family dynamic. In fact, she continued, her voice growing stronger and more confident, I think tonight is a perfect opportunity to acknowledge something that we've all been too polite to say directly. Celeste has always been, well, let's be honest, the poor one in our family. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning everything they touched. Not poor in spirit, of course, Vivian added quickly, as if that clarification somehow softened the blow. But poor in resources, poor in prospects, poor in the kind of advantages that the rest of us have been blessed with. And I think we should celebrate the fact that despite being the poor one, despite all the limitations that come with that status, she's managed to create this lovely little life for herself. The cruelty was breathtaking in its casual precision. In front of 200 people, including my new husband's family and friends, including my colleagues and the few genuine relationships I'd built over the years, Vivian had just reduced me to a charity case whose modest achievements deserved praise primarily because expectations had been set so low. I could see the shock on Jonathan's face, the horror on the faces of my community center colleagues who knew how hard I worked and how much I cared about the people we served. I could see Vivian's social circle nodding in agreement, confirming their shared understanding that this public humiliation was somehow appropriate and necessary. But what I felt, standing there in my simple white dress in the middle of that small dance floor, wasn't shame or embarrassment or the crushing defeat that Vivian was clearly expecting. What I felt was a kind of crystalline clarity, a perfect moment of understanding that this was exactly the opportunity one had been waiting for. And so, Vivian concluded, raising her wine glass in what she clearly intended to be a gracious toast, let's all raise our glasses to Celeste, our beloved poor one, who has proven that even people with limited means and modest prospects can find happiness if they just learn to accept what life gives them. The room remained frozen in shocked silence. Some people had automatically started to raise their glasses before the full impact of the words hit them. Others were clearly struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Jonathan looked like he wanted to say something, to defend me or call out the obvious cruelty of what had just happened. But I squeezed his hand gently, and when he looked at me, I smiled. Because Vivian had just given me the perfect gift. She had just delivered, in front of exactly the right audience, the most devastating insult she could devise. She had just provided me with the perfect justification for what was about to happen next. And what was about to happen next was going to change everything. I walked slowly toward Vivian, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor in the otherwise silent ballroom. Every eye in the room was on me, some filled with pity, others with curiosity about how I would respond to such a devastating public humiliation. But what they saw on my face wasn't shame or tears or the broken spirit that Vivian was clearly expecting. What they saw was a calm, confident smile. "Thank you, Vivian," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room as I reached for the microphone. "What a thoughtful speech. You're absolutely right. It is time for honesty about family dynamics and about who the real poor one is at this gathering." I could see confusion flickering across her face. This wasn't the reaction she had anticipated. She had expected collapse, not composure. She had expected me to shrink away in humiliation, not step forward with confidence. "You know," I continued, still smiling as I adjusted the microphone, "I've been keeping a secret from this family for quite some time now. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because I wanted to save the revelation for exactly the right moment. And Vivian, you've just given me the perfect opportunity." The room was so quiet I could hear people breathing. Jonathan had moved closer, positioning himself where he could see both me and the crowd, his expression showing a mixture of anticipation and concern. He knew what was coming, but even he wasn't sure exactly how I planned to deliver it. For the past 5 years, I said, turning to address the entire room rather than just Vivian, while you've all known me as Celeste, the quiet community center worker who could barely afford her rent, I've also been living under another identity. Some of you might have heard of a company called Meridian Dynamics. There was a murmur of recognition from several people in the crowd. Meridian Dynamics had been in the business news quite frequently lately, and anyone who followed the tech industry or government contracting would have been familiar with the name. Meridian Dynamics, I continued, is currently valued at just over $1.2 billion. It employs over 3,000 people across 4 countries, and it's revolutionizing digital security infrastructure for everyone from Fortune 500 companies to the United States Department of Defense. The murmurs were getting louder now, but I could see from the expressions in the room that most people hadn't yet made the connection I was building toward. The company was founded 5 years ago by a mysterious entrepreneur known only as C.H. Morgan, I said, pausing for effect. C.H. Morgan has been extremely private, conducting business through lawyers and representatives, never appearing at public events or giving interviews. Very few people knew the real identity behind that name. I turned back to Vivian, whose face had gone completely pale. She was beginning to understand that something was very wrong with her assumptions about this moment, but she hadn't yet grasped the full scope of what was happening. Well, I said, my smile widening, allow me to introduce myself properly. I am C.H. Morgan. Celeste Hartwell Morgan. And Meridian Dynamics is my company. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps echoed through the room, followed by excited whispers and the sound of people shifting in their chairs to get a better view. Several guests actually stood up, as if they needed to see me from a different angle to process what they had just heard. But I wasn't finished. You see, Vivian, I said, turning back to my stepmother, who looked like she had been struck by lightning, you're absolutely right that someone at this gathering is poor. But it isn't me. I reached into the small clutch purse I had been carrying and pulled out a folded document. This morning, about 3 hours before my wedding ceremony, Meridian Dynamics completed the acquisition of several companies that I think you might find interesting. I unfolded the paper slowly, building the suspense as I had seen Vivian do so many times when she wanted to maximize the impact of her pronouncements. Thornfield, Blackstone and Associates, your law firm, is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Meridian Dynamics. The acquisition was completed through a private purchase of their outstanding debt, which my company has been quietly accumulating for the past 18 months. Vivian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I could see her processing the implications, understanding that her most trusted advisors now worked for me. Ashford Properties, your family's real estate development company, is now also under Meridian Dynamics ownership, acquired through a series of strategic partnerships and debt purchases that began 2 years ago. The color was draining from Vivian's face so rapidly that I was briefly concerned she might actually faint. But I pressed on. And most interestingly, I continued, the mortgage on the Ashford Heights mansion, your family home, was transferred to a Meridian Dynamics subsidiary last month when Willowbrook First National sold their loan portfolio to improve their liquidity position. The silence in the room was deafening. 200 people were witnessing the complete reversal of everything they thought they knew about the power dynamics in this family. So you see, Vivian, I said, my voice gentle but unmistakably firm, when you called me the poor one, you were actually talking to the woman who now owns your house, your business, your law firm, and most of your assets. I paused, letting that information settle over the crowd like a blanket of shock. But don't worry, I added, and now my smile had taken on a distinctly different quality. I'm not heartless. I don't plan to foreclose on the mortgage or dissolve the companies. You can keep living in the house and running your business, just like always. Relief flickered across Vivian's face for a moment, but I wasn't finished. You'll just be doing it as my tenant and my employee. The room erupted. People were talking over each other, some applauding, others gasping in shock. I could see several people pulling out their phones, presumably to check the financial news or search for information about Meridian Dynamics. The Society page correspondent who had been invited specifically for this moment was scribbling frantically in her notebook. But my attention was focused on Vivian, who was standing frozen in place, the microphone hanging limply in her hand. Her face had gone through several color changes, settling on a sickly pale green that suggested she was struggling not to be physically ill. The interesting thing about being truly wealthy, I continued, gently taking the microphone back from her nerveless fingers, is that you don't need to announce it or use it to make other people feel small. You can just be generous. You can just live your life without needing to diminish anyone else. I turned back to the crowd, which was still buzzing with excitement and disbelief. I've been donating anonymously to dozens of charities for years, including substantial contributions to this very community center where I supposedly work my modest little job. I've been funding scholarships, supporting local businesses, and investing in community development projects throughout Willowbrook. Not because I wanted recognition, but because I actually care about this community and the people in it. I could see my community center colleagues in the crowd, their faces showing a mixture of shock, pride, and sudden understanding about some of the mysterious funding sources that had kept their programs running smoothly. And now, I said, raising my own glass in a toast, I'd like to invite everyone to celebrate not just my marriage to Jonathan, but also the end of a very long period of, shall we say, family misunderstandings. The applause was thunderous. People were on their feet, cheering not just for the dramatic revelation but for the justice of it all. They had witnessed years of subtle cruelty, and now they were seeing it definitively answered. Vivian, meanwhile, had sunk into the nearest chair, her face buried in her hands. The woman who had spent the evening planning to humiliate me publicly had instead provided the perfect stage for the most spectacular reversal of power anyone in Willowbrook had ever witnessed. And the best part was, it was all completely true. The immediate aftermath of my revelation was unlike anything I could have imagined. The small ballroom of the Willowbrook country inn had transformed from a modest wedding reception into what felt like the epicenter of a social earthquake. Conversations erupted at every table as guests tried to process what they had just witnessed. Phones appeared as people frantically searched for information about Meridian dynamics, and several of the more prominent business leaders in attendance were already making their way toward me with expressions that ranged from impressed to calculating. But my attention remained focused on my family, particularly Vivian, who sat motionless in her chair like a statue of someone who had just witnessed the end of the world. Her perfectly styled hair was still immaculate, her expensive navy dress still elegant, but everything else about her had crumbled. The confidence, the superiority, the casual cruelty that had defined her for as long as I had known her, all of it had evaporated in the space of a few minutes. Anastasia was the first to recover enough to speak. She approached me with unsteady steps, her face pale and her eyes wide with something that might have been fear or awe or both. "Celeste," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't understand. How is this possible? How long have you been?" She trailed off, unable to complete the question because she couldn't quite grasp what the question should be. 5 years, I replied gently. I started building Meridian dynamics during my senior year of college. While you were at Yale studying art history, I was teaching myself advanced programming and developing security protocols in my dorm room. The timeline seemed to hit her like a physical blow. But we thought. Mom always said you were. She glanced back at Vivian, who was still staring at nothing with an expression of complete shock. Your mother said a lot of things, I replied. Most of them were wrong. Evangeline appeared at Anastasia's side, her approach more aggressive but no less shaken. She had always been the sharper of the two twins, the one more likely to challenge rather than simply accept, and even now she was trying to find some way to regain control of the narrative. This is impossible, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. You work at a community center. You drive that piece of junk Honda. You live in that tiny apartment. We've seen your life, Celeste. We know what you are. You know what I chose to show you, I corrected. There's a difference. But why? Anastasia asked, and there was genuine pain in her voice now. Why would you hide this from us? Why would you let us think? She gestured helplessly at the scene around us. Because I wanted to see who you really were, I said simply. I wanted to understand what kind of people you would be when you thought you had all the power and I had none. And you showed me. The answer seemed to deflate both twins. They exchanged a look that contained years of shared assumptions crashing down simultaneously. For the first time in their lives, they were being forced to confront the possibility that they weren't the golden children of a superior family, but rather the privileged daughters of a woman who had systematically tormented someone far more successful than any of them. Meanwhile, my father had finally managed to pull himself together enough to approach the group. Robert Hartwell looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. His face was gray, his hands were shaking, and when he spoke, his voice cracked with something that might have been guilt or disbelief or both. "Celeste," he said, and then stopped, as if he had rehearsed this conversation but forgotten all his lines. "Sweetheart, I had no idea. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me know what you had accomplished?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with 12 years of history and hurt. I looked at the man who had once been my champion, who had read me bedtime stories and cheered at my school plays, who had gradually transformed into someone who viewed me through Vivian's lens of disappointment and limitation. "When?" I asked quietly. "When exactly should I have told you? During one of those family dinners when you were too busy praising Anastasia's latest charity gala to ask about my day? When you were writing checks for Evangeline's law school applications while telling me I needed to be more realistic about my prospects? When you were explaining to your friends that I was the one who needed to learn character through struggle?" Each question hit him like a physical blow, and I could see the recognition dawning in his eyes. He was remembering specific moments, specific conversations, specific times when he had chosen Vivian's narrative over his own daughter's reality. "I loved you," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I still love you. I thought I was doing what was best." Vivian said a lot of things, I interrupted. "But Dad, I'm your daughter. I was your daughter before I was her stepdaughter. And you chose to believe her version of who I was instead of trusting what you knew about who I had always been." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance to the ballroom. 3 men in expensive suits had arrived and were speaking quietly to the venue staff. I recognized them immediately. They were attorneys from the New York firm that handled my corporate legal affairs, and their presence meant that the more formal aspects of the evening's revelations were about to begin. The lead attorney, Marcus Sullivan, approached our group with a briefcase and the kind of professionally neutral expression that suggested he was about to deliver information that would be significant but not necessarily pleasant. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, using my married name for the first time and causing another ripple of shock through the nearby guests who overheard. "The documents you requested have been prepared and notarized. Would you like me to proceed with the presentations?" I nodded, and he opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Ashford Hartwell," he said, turning to Vivian with formal politeness, "I have several documents that require your immediate attention." Vivian looked up slowly, as if she was emerging from a deep trance. "What kind of documents?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Transfer agreements, primarily," Sullivan replied. "Since Meridian Dynamics now holds controlling interests in your primary assets, there are some administrative procedures that need to be completed. Nothing too complicated, mainly acknowledgments of the new ownership structure and agreements regarding ongoing management arrangements." He handed her a thick folder of papers, and I could see her hands trembling as she accepted them. "You don't need to review them tonight," he added with professional courtesy. "But they will need to be signed and returned within 30 days to ensure continuity of operations." The implications were sinking in not just for Vivian, but for everyone within earshot. This wasn't just a dramatic revelation, it was a complete restructuring of the economic foundation that had supported the Ashford family's lifestyle for generations. "What about us?" Evangeline asked, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "What about our trust funds? Our college accounts?" Sullivan consulted his notes with the detached professionalism of someone delivering information that was factual rather than personal. "The trust funds were restructured as part of the debt consolidation process. They're now managed through Meridian Dynamics Financial Services Division. The terms remain essentially the same, but the ultimate authority over distributions has changed. In other words, I now controlled their money too." The twins exchanged a look of pure terror. For the first time in their privileged lives, they were experiencing what it felt like to have their security dependent on someone else's goodwill, someone they had spent years treating as inferior. Around the room, the other guests were beginning to understand the full scope of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a family drama or a business revelation, it was the complete inversion of a social hierarchy that had defined Willowbrook for decades. The woman they had all been taught to view as the family charity case had just revealed herself to be not only more successful than any of them had imagined, but powerful enough to control the financial destiny of the family that had rejected her. The conversations buzzing around us reflected this realization. I could hear fragments. Did you know she owned? And, I can't believe Vivian just. And, do you think she'll, all centered around the recognition that the social dynamics they thought they understood had been completely false. But what struck me most was the silence from Vivian herself. The woman who had never been at a loss for words, who had always had an opinion or a judgment or a cutting remark ready for any situation, sat quietly reviewing the documents that formalized her transformation from family matriarch to dependent employee. For 12 years, she had controlled every conversation, every family dynamic, every moment of power and authority in our household. Now, surrounded by 200 witnesses and faced with legal documents that proved her complete misjudgment of the person she had tormented, she finally had nothing to say. And honestly, that silence was more satisfying than any revenge I could have planned. 3 months later, I stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower in downtown Willowbrook, watching the city sprawl out below me like a living map of everything that had changed since my wedding day. The building itself was new, construction had been completed just weeks before, and it now stood as the tallest structure in the city, a gleaming testament to what could be accomplished when someone refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose on them. The office was everything I had never allowed myself to dream of during those years of pretending to be someone smaller, someone less, someone who needed to be grateful for scraps. The space was elegant but comfortable, filled with natural light and furnished with pieces that reflected my actual taste rather than what someone else thought was appropriate for my station. On the walls hung awards and recognitions from industry organizations, photos from speaking engagements at major universities, and a framed copy of the Forbes cover story that had run 2 weeks after my wedding. The Billionaire Bride, how Celeste Morgan built an empire in secret. But what I treasured most in that office wasn't any of the symbols of professional success. It was a small, handwritten thank you note from Maria Santos, a single mother whose literacy program at the community center had helped her earn her GED and eventually land a job with enough stability to move her family out of subsidized housing. She had no idea that her note was sitting in the office of a billionaire. She only knew that someone at the community center had cared enough to help her change her life. That note reminded me every day why the revenge had been necessary, but also why it couldn't be the end of the story. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of changes, some more satisfying than others. The Willowbrook social scene had been completely restructured around the revelation of my true identity. The same people who had nodded knowingly when Vivian dismissed my accomplishments were now falling over themselves to get invitations to events at my mountain estate. The country club that had always been politely available but never particularly welcoming had offered me membership on their board of directors. The mayor had personally requested a meeting to discuss how Meridian dynamics might contribute to the city's economic development initiatives. I accepted some of these overtures and declined others, but always with grace rather than the petty vindictiveness that some people seem to expect. Revenge had served its purpose, but I had no interest in becoming the kind of person who used power primarily to make others feel small. I had seen what that looked like, and I refused to repeat those patterns. The most complicated changes had been within my family itself. Vivian had signed all the necessary documents and had largely retreated from public life, spending most of her time at the mansion that she now understood belonged to me. She was polite during our few interactions, almost formally so, but the casual cruelty that had defined our relationship for 12 years had disappeared entirely. Whether this was due to genuine remorse or simple fear of consequences, I couldn't say. But the change was absolute. Anastasia and Evangeline had both requested meetings with me during the weeks following the wedding, conversations that had been awkward but surprisingly honest. They were struggling to reconcile the person they thought they had known with the reality of who I actually was, and they were also grappling with the recognition that their entire understanding of family dynamics had been built on false assumptions. I keep thinking about all the times Anastasia had said during one of these conversations, trailing off as she tried to find words for behaviors that seemed inexcusable in retrospect. "You were children," I had replied. "You believed what the adults in your life taught you to believe. That's not your fault." It was true, but it was also incomplete. They were adults now, and they had choices to make about who they wanted to be going forward. Both twins were making genuine efforts to rebuild their relationship with me, but it would take time to establish something real after so many years of artificial hierarchy. My father had been the most persistent in seeking reconciliation, and also the most difficult for me to forgive. His betrayal had cut deeper because it represented the abandonment of someone who had once known better. But during a long conversation in my office 2 months after the wedding, we had finally begun to address the years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. "I lost myself," he had admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I was so desperate to make the marriage work, so grateful that Vivian had brought stability and elegance into our lives, that I convinced myself her way of seeing things was right. I told myself that she understood the world better than I did, that she was preparing you for reality in ways I was too soft-hearted to do." "You didn't lose yourself, Dad," I had replied. "You chose convenience over courage. You chose the easy path of agreeing with her instead of the harder path of defending your own daughter." It had been a difficult conversation, but a necessary one. We were slowly rebuilding something, but it would be based on honesty rather than the comfortable fiction that past hurts could be easily forgotten. The most important change, though, had been in my relationship with Jonathan. Marriage had always been a risk when one partner was keeping such enormous secrets, but Jonathan had proven himself to be exactly the man I had believed him to be. He had adjusted to our new circumstances with humor and grace, supporting my decisions about how to handle the family situation while never trying to influence them based on his own discomfort. "I married Celeste," he had said when a reporter asked him how he felt about suddenly being married to one of the country's youngest female billionaires. "Everything else is just interesting details." We had used part of our honeymoon, a 3-week trip through Europe that was significantly more luxurious than the weekend at a bed and breakfast we had originally planned, to talk through how we wanted our life together to look. Jonathan had decided to continue teaching, at least for now, because he loved the work and believed it was important. I had expanded my involvement with the community center, eventually endowing it with enough funding to ensure its programs could continue indefinitely without worrying about grant applications and budget restrictions. The most satisfying development had been the growth of Meridian Dynamics itself. With my identity no longer secret, I had been able to take a more public role in the company's development, accepting speaking engagements, participating in industry conferences, and building partnerships that had been impossible when I was operating behind layers of corporate anonymity. The company's valuation had increased by another 40% since the wedding, and we were expanding into international markets at a pace that exceeded our most optimistic projections. But beyond the financial success, I was finally able to be fully myself in all aspects of my life. No more careful calculations about which clothes to wear or which car to drive. No more deliberate limitation of my achievements to avoid uncomfortable questions. No more pretending to be grateful for scraps when I was capable of creating abundance. The little girl who had stood in her father's living room holding a homemade Father's Day card, wondering why her love wasn't enough, had grown into a woman who understood that her worth had never been dependent on anyone else's recognition. The quiet teenager who had learned to make herself invisible at family dinners had become someone who could command attention in boardrooms and conference halls around the world. Most importantly, I had learned to distinguish between justice and vengeance, between defending yourself and becoming the thing you once fought against. The revelation at my wedding had been necessary, not just for my own sense of closure, but to establish a new foundation for any future relationship with my family. But it had been an ending, not a beginning. The real work had been everything that came after, building a life based on my own values rather than their limitations, creating relationships based on honesty rather than performance, and using my success to make things better rather than simply to prove a point. As I watched the sun set over Willowbrook from my office windows, I realized that I had finally become the person I was always meant to be, not in spite of the years of dismissal and humiliation, but because I had refused to let those experiences define my sense of what was possible. The door was closed on that old life, that old version of myself who had needed their approval to feel worthy. In its place was something far more valuable, a woman who had learned that the only permission she needed to be extraordinary was her own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.